So we'll call the meeting to order. The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting 154. The International Grand Committee on Big Data, Privacy and Democracy. And I don't need to go through the list of countries that we have already mentioned previously, but I will go through our witnesses just very briefly. So the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, Mr. Daniel Therrien, again, the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. As an individual, Joseph A. Kanatachi, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Privacy, United Nations. And we are having some challenges just with the live video feed from Malta, is where it's broadcasting from. So we'll keep on working through that, I guess. I'm told by the clerk we might have to just go to an audio feed to get the conversation, but we will do what we have to do. And then again, we'd like to welcome the United States Federal Election Commission, the chair, Ellen Weintraub. So first of all, I just would like to speak to the order and structure. It'll be very similar to our first meeting this morning, so we'll have one question per delegation. The Canadian group will have one from each party, and we'll go through until we run out of time, different representatives to speak to the issue. So hopefully that makes sense. It'll make sense more as we go. So I'd like to give, again, the opportunity for Mr. Collins to open it up. I would like to thank the members that did come to our question period today, and I personally thank the Speaker for recognizing the delegation. So again, thanks for coming. Mr. Collins.
Thank you. If I could put my first question to all three of the witnesses. Are we doing statements
first?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you want me to? Yeah, we'll do that first. Is that okay?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay. So we'll just have opening statements. We'll start with Mr. Therrien. Go ahead for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the Grant Committee, thank you for the invitation to address you today. My remarks will address 3 points that I think go to the heart of your study. First, that freedom and democracy cannot exist without privacy and the protection of our personal information. Second, that in meeting the risks posed by digital harms, such as disinformation campaigns, we need to strengthen our laws in order to better protect rights. Lastly, I will share suggestions on what needs to be done in Canada, as I'm an expert in Canadian privacy regulation, so that we have 21st century laws in place to ensure the privacy rights of Canadians are protected effectively. I trust that these suggestions made in a Canadian context can also be relevant in an international context. As you know, my UK counterpart, the Information and Commissioner's Office, in its report on privacy and the political process, clearly found that lax privacy compliance and micro-targeting by political parties have exposed gaps in the regulatory landscape. These gaps, in turn, have been exploited to target voters via social media and to spread disinformation. Je vais passer au français maintenant.
I'll now turn to French. The Cambridge Analytica scandal highlighted the unexpected uses to which personal information can be put. And as my office concluded in our Facebook investigation, uncovered a privacy framework that was actually an empty shell. It reminded citizens that privacy is a fundamental right and a necessary precondition for the exercise of other fundamental rights, including democracy. In fact, privacy is nothing less than a prerequisite for freedom, the freedom to live and develop independently as individuals, away from the watchful eye of surveillance by the state or by commercial enterprises, while participating voluntarily and actively in the regular day-to-day activities of a modern society.
Gravely aware, the incidents and breaches that have now become all too common go well beyond matters of privacy, as serious as I believe those to be. Beyond questions of privacy and data protection, democratic institutions and citizens' very faith in our electoral process are now under a cloud of distrust and suspicion. The same digital tools like social networks that public agencies like electoral regulators thought could be leveraged to effectively engage a new generation of citizens are also being used to subvert, not strengthen, our democracies. The interplay between data protection, micro-targeting, and disinformation represent a real threat to our laws and institutions. Some parts of the world have started to mount a response to these risks with various forms of proposed regulation. I will note a few. One, The recent UK white paper on digital harms proposes the creation of a digital regulatory body and offers a range of potential interventions with commercial organizations to regulate a whole spectrum of problems. The proposed model for the UK is to add a regulator agency for digital platforms that will help them develop specific codes of conduct to deal with child exploitation, hate propaganda, foreign election interference, and other pernicious online harms. Second, earlier this month, the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online highlighted the need for effective enforcement, the application of ethical standards, and appropriate cooperation. And finally, just last week here in Canada, the government released a new proposal for an update to our federal commercial data protection law, as well as an overarching digital charter meant to help protect privacy, counter misuse of data, and help ensure companies are communicating clearly with users. Toutes ces approches.
Underlying all these approaches is the need to adapt our laws to the new realities of our digitally interconnected world. There's a growing realization that the age of self-regulation has come to an end. The solution is not to get people to turn off their computers or to stop using social media, search engines, or other digital services. Many of these services meet real needs. Rather, the ultimate goal is to allow individuals to benefit from digital services, to socialize, learn, and generally develop as persons while remaining safe and confident that their privacy rights will be respected.
Principles that I believe can guide government efforts to reestablish citizens' trust. Putting citizens and their rights at the center of these discussions is vitally important in my view, and legislators' work should focus on rights-based solutions. In Canada, the starting point, in my view, should be to give the law a rights-based foundation worthy of privacy's quasi-constitutional status in this country. This rights-based foundation is applicable in many countries where their law frames certain privacy rights explicitly as such, as rights, with practices and processes that support and enforce this important right. I think Canada should continue to have a law that is technologically neutral and principles-based. Having a law that is based on internationally recognized principles, such as those of the OECD, is important for the interoperability of the legislation. Adopting an international treaty for privacy and data protection would be an excellent idea, but in the meantime, countries should aim to develop interoperable laws. But we also need a rights-based statute, meaning a law that confers enforceable rights to individuals while also allowing for responsible innovation. Such a law would define privacy in its broadest and truest sense, such as freedom from unjustified surveillance, recognizing its value and correlation to other fundamental rights. Privacy is not limited to consent, access, and transparency. These are important mechanisms, but they do not define the right itself. Codifying the right in its broadest sense, along the principles-based and technologically neutral nature of the current Canadian law, would ensure it can endure over time despite the certainty of technological developments. One final point I wish to make has to do with independent oversight. Privacy cannot be protected without independent regulators, empowered to impose fines and to verify compliance proactively to ensure organizations are truly accountable for the protection of information. This last notion, demonstrable accountability, is a needed response to today's world where business models are opaque and information flows are increasingly complex. Individuals are unlikely to file a complaint when they are unaware of a practice that may harm them. This is why it is so important for the regulator to have the authority to proactively inspect the practices of organizations. Where consent is not practical or effective, which is a point made by many organizations in this day and age. And organizations are expected to fill the protective void through accountability. These organizations must be required to demonstrate true accountability upon request. What I have presented today as solutions are not new concepts, but as this committee takes a global approach to the problem of disinformation, it's also an opportunity for domestic actors, regulators, government officials, elected representatives, to recognize what best practices and solutions are emerging, and to take action to protect our citizens, our rights, and our institutions. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you once again, Mr. Therrien. We'll go next. We're going to just double check whether Mr. Kanatachi is able to stream. No? Okay, so we're going to go up next to Ms. Weintraub. Go ahead for 10 minutes.
I can speak. Hello.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ms. Weintraub. We just heard the comments. He's able to speak. So do we have the feeder or do we not?
We have audio, we don't have video.
Okay.
We can just leave it static
Audio?
image.
Okay, so maybe we'll go, my apologies, Ms. Weintraub. I guess we have him on, so we'll go ahead. Mr. Kanatachi, go ahead for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, as well as members of the Grant Committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I will try to build on what Mr. Therrien has said in order to cover a few more points, but I'll also make some references to what the previous witness has just presented. Firstly, I will be trying to take a more international view, though the themes which are covered by the committee are very global. They are very global by nature. And that's why when it comes to global, the previous witness spoke about an international treaty. One of the reasons why, as I will be explaining, I have decided in my mandate at the United Nations to go through a number of priorities when it comes to privacy is that the general framework, that is to say, the general framework of privacy and data protection law, insofar as an international treaty is concerned, already exists. It doesn't happen to be a specifically UN treaty, it happens to be Convention 108 and Convention 108 Plus, which is already ratified by 55 nations across the world. Morocco was the latest one to present its document of ratification yesterday. So when people meet in Strasbourg or elsewhere to discuss their actions and interoperability within an international framework, there are already 70 countries between ratified states and observer states who discuss the framework afforded by that international legal instrument. And I would indeed encourage Canada to consider adhering to that instrument. Canadian law, while I'm not an expert on Canadian law, I've been following it since 1982, and I think Canadian law is pretty close in most cases, and I think it would be a welcome addition to that growing growing group of nations. The second point that I wished to make is, I'll be very brief in this, but just also share preoccupations about attacks on democracy and the fact that the internet is being increasingly used in order to manipulate people's opinions through monitoring their profiles in a number of ways. The Cambridge Analytica case, of course, is the classic case we have for our consideration, but there are other cases too in other countries around the world, in a number of nations. I should also perhaps explain that the 6-7 priorities that I've set for my United Nations mandate, perhaps to a certain extent summarize, if not all, many of the major problems that we are facing in the privacy and data protection field. The first priority should not surprise you, ladies and gentlemen, because it relates to the very reasons why my mandate was born, which is security and surveillance. You will recall that my United Nations mandate was born in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, and it won't surprise you, therefore, that we have dedicated a great deal of attention internationally to security and surveillance. I am very pleased that Canada participates very actively in one of the fora that I have set up, which is the International Intelligence Oversight Forum, because as the previous witness has just stated, oversight is a key element that should be addressed, and I was also pleased to see some significant progress in the Canadian sphere over the past 12 to 24 months. There's a lot to be said about surveillance, but I don't have much left out of my 10 minutes, so perhaps I can respond to questions. What I'll restrict myself to saying at this stage is that globally we see the same problems. In other words, we don't have a proper solution for jurisdiction. Jurisdiction remains issues of jurisdiction, and definitions of offences remain one of the greatest problems we have, notwithstanding the existence of the Cybercrime Convention. Security and surveillance, and basically state-sponsored behavior in cyberspace and appropriate state-sponsored behavior in cyberspace is still a glaring problem. Some nations are not very comfortable about talking about their espionage activities in cyberspace. Some treat it as their own backyard, but in reality, there is evidence that hundreds of millions, that the privacy of hundreds of millions of people around the world, not in just one country, around the world, have been subjected to privacy intrusion by the state-sponsored services of one actor or another, including most of the, if not all of the, permanent powers of the United Nations. The problem remains one of jurisdiction and defining limits there. We have prepared a draft legal instrument on security and surveillance in cyberspace. However, the political mood across the world doesn't seem conducive to immediate discussions on those points, with the result that we've seen some unilateral action by the United States in its Cloud Act, without too much take-up at this moment in time. So whether unilateral action will work, I encourage discussion even on principles of the Cloud Act, because that very discussion, even if it doesn't lead to immediate agreements, will at least get people to focus on the problems that exist at that stage. I'll quickly pass to big data and open data. In the interest of economy of time, I'll refer the committee to the report on big data and open data that I presented to the General Assembly of the United Nations in October of 2018. Quite frankly, I would advise the committee to be very wary of joining up the two in such a way that big data, that open data, continues to be a bit like motherhood and apple pie when it comes to politicians proclaiming all the good that it's going to do for the world. The truth is that we are, in the principles of big data and open data, looking at key fundamental issues when it comes to privacy and data protection. In Canadian law, as in the law of other countries, and including the laws of all those countries who adhere to Convention 108, the purpose specification principle that data should be only collected and used for a specified purpose or compatible purpose lives on as a fundamental principle. It lives on also as a principle where in the recent GDPR in Europe, however, we have to remember that in many cases, when one is using to use big data analytics, one is seeking to repurpose that data for a different purpose. Once again, I refer the committee to my report and the detailed recommendations there. At this moment in time, I have out for consultation a document on health data, this document, together with recommendations, we are expected actually to be debating in France in a special meeting between the 11th and 12th of June, so over the coming 2 weeks. I trust that there will be a healthy Canadian presence at that meeting too. We have received many positive comments about the report. We're trying to build on existing consensus on health data, but I'd like to direct the committee's attention to how important health data is and how growing amounts of health data are being collected each and every day, with the use of smartphones and Fitbits and other wearables being used in a way which we wouldn't have thought about 15, 20 years ago. Another consultation paper that I have out, which I would direct the committee's attention to, is one on gender and privacy. I'm hoping actually to organize a public consultation, which has already started through an online consultation, but I'm hoping to have a public meeting probably in New York on the 30th and 31st of October. Gender and privacy continues to be a very important yet controversial topic, and one where I would welcome continued Canadian contribution and participation. I think you would not be surprised if I were to say that I have, amongst the 5 task forces that I've set up, I also have a task force on big data, on the use of personal data by corporations. I make it a point to meet the major corporations, including Google, Facebook, Apple, Yahoo, but also some of the non-US ones, including Deutsche Telekom, Huawei, etc., at least twice a year, all together around the table, in an effort to try to get the collaboration in devising new safeguards and remedies for privacy, especially in cyberspace. Which brings me to the final point I'll mention for now, which is the 6th, and it's linked to the previous one on corporations, on the use of personal data by corporations, and that's the priority of privacy and children. I have become increasingly concerned about privacy issues, especially those affecting children and as online citizens from a very early age. This is, as the previous witness has borne witness, we are looking at some leading new innovative legislation, such as that in the United Kingdom, not only the one about digital harms, but also one about age-appropriate behavior and the liability of corporations. I am broaching the subject formally next with the corporations at our September 2019 meeting, and I look forward to be able to achieve some progress on the subject of privacy and children and greater accountability and action from the corporations in a set of recommendations which we shall be devising during the next 12 to 18 months. I'll stop here for now, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to receiving questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kantachi. We'll go now to Ms. Weintraub. I just wanted to explain what the flashing lights are. In Canadian Parliament, it's a signal that the vote's about to happen in about 30 minutes, I believe, today. So we have an agreement between our parties that one member will stay from each party. The rest are clear to go vote. So all the rest of us, the meeting will continue. We won't stop. But it isn't a fire alarm. We're good to go.
Being the only New Democrat, do I have to, as the Clash would say, do I have to stay or should I go?
You probably should stay. So it's been clear that we have one member per. So yeah. So I just wanted to make that clear. That's what's going on. So we'll go to Ms. Weintraub now for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. I am the chair of the Federal Election Commission in the United States. I represent a bipartisan body, but the views that I'm going to express are entirely my own. I'm going to shift the topic from privacy concerns to influence campaigns. In March of this year, Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III completed his report on the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Its conclusions were chilling. The Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in sweeping and systemic fashion. First, a Russian entity carried out a social media campaign that favored one presidential candidate and disparaged the other. Second, a Russian intelligence service conducted computer intrusion operations against campaign entities, employees, and volunteers, and then released stolen documents. On April 26, 2019, at the Council on Foreign Relations, FBI Director Christopher A. Wray warned of the aggressive, unabated, malign foreign influence campaign consisting of, quote, the use of social media, fake news propaganda, false personas, etc., to spin us up, pit us against each other, sow divisiveness and discord, undermine Americans' faith in democracy. That is not just an election cycle threat, it's pretty much a 365 days a year threat, and that has absolutely continued. And while he noted that enormous strides have been made since 2016 by all different federal agencies, state and local election officials, social media companies, etc., to protect the physical infrastructure of our elections, he said, I think we recognize that our adversaries are going to keep adapting and upping their game, and so we are very much viewing 2018 as just kind of a dress rehearsal for the big show in 2020. Last week at the House of Representatives, a representative of the Department of Homeland Security also emphasized that Russia and other foreign countries, including China and Iran, conducted influence activities in the 2018 midterms and messaging campaigns that targeted the United States to promote their strategic interests. As you probably know, election administration in the United States is decentralized. It's handled at the state and local level, so other officials in the United States are charged with protecting the physical infrastructure of our elections, the brick-and-mortar electoral apparatus run by state and local governments, and it is vital that they continue to do so. But from my seat on the Federal Election Commission, I work every day with another kind of election infrastructure, the foundation of our democracy, the faith that citizens have that they know who's influencing our elections. And that faith has been under malicious attack from our foreign foes through disinformation campaigns. That faith has been under assault by the corrupting influence of dark money that may be masking illegal foreign sources. That faith has been besieged by online political advertising from unknown sources. That faith has been damaged through cyber attacks against political campaigns ill-equipped to defend themselves on their own. That faith must be restored, but it cannot be restored by Silicon Valley. Rebuilding this part of our elections infrastructure is not something we can leave in the hands of the tech companies, the companies that built the platforms now being abused by our foreign rivals to attack our democracies. In 2016, fake accounts originating in Russia generated content that was seen by 126 million Americans on Facebook, another 20 million Americans on Instagram, for a total of 146 million Americans, and there were only 137 million voters in that election. As recently as 2016, Facebook was accepting payment for political ads about the United States elections in rubles. And as recently as last year, in October of 2018, journalists posing as every member of the United States Senate tried to place ads in their names on Facebook, and Facebook accepted them all. So when the guys on the other panel who keep telling us they got this, we know they don't. And by the way, I also invited Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, all those guys, to come and testify at a hearing at my commission when we were talking about internet disclosure of advertising. And once again, they didn't show up. They didn't even send a surrogate that time. They just sent us written comments. So I feel you guys. I also, this is plainly really important to all of us. In the United States, spending on digital political ads went up 260% from 2014 to 2018, from one midterm election to the next, for a total of $900 million in advertising, in digital advertising in the 2018 election. Now, that was still less than was spent on broadcast advertising, but obviously digital is the wave of the future. when it comes to political advertising. And there have been constructive suggestions and proposals in the United States to try and address this. The Honest Ads Act, which would subject Internet ads to the same rules as broadcast ads. The Disclose Act, which would broaden the transparency for and fight against dark money. And at my own agency, I've been trying to advance a rule that would improve Internet disclaimers on the Internet advertising. But all of those efforts so far have been stymied. Now, we have been actually fortunate that the platforms have tried to do something. They have tried to step up, in part, I'm sure, to try and ward off regulation, but in part to respond to widespread dissatisfaction with the information that they were providing and the disclosure that they were providing. So they have been improving, in the United States at least, the way they disclose who's behind their ads. But it's not enough, because questions keep coming up, such as what triggers the requirement to post the disclaimer? Can the disclaimers be relied upon to honestly identify the sources of the digital ads? Based on the study about the 100 senator ads, apparently not. Not all the time, anyway. Does the identifying information travel with the content when information is forwarded? And how are the platforms dealing with the transmission of encrypted information? Peer-to-peer communications represents a burgeoning field for political activity, and it raises a whole new set of potential issues. Whatever measures are adopted today run the serious risk of targeting the problems of the last cycle, not the next one. And we know that our adversaries are constantly upping their game, as I said, and constantly improvising and changing their strategies. I also have serious concerns about the risks of foreign money creeping into our election system, particularly through corporate sources. This is not a hypothetical concern. We recently closed an enforcement case that involved foreign nationals who managed to funnel $1.3 million into the coffers of a super PAC in the 2016 election. And this is just one way that foreign nationals are making their presence and influence felt even at the highest levels of our political campaigns. These kinds of cases are increasingly common, and these kinds of complaints are increasingly common in the United States. From September 2016 to April 2019, the number of matters before the Commission that include alleged violations of the foreign national ban increased from 14 to 40, and there were 32 open matters as of April 1st of this year. So this is, again, an ongoing concern when it comes to foreign influence. As everything you've heard today demonstrates, serious thought has to be given to the impact of social media on our democracy. Facebook's originating philosophy of move fast and break things, cooked up 16 years ago in a college dorm room, has breathtaking consequences when the thing they're breaking could be our democracies themselves. Facebook, Twitter, Google, these and other technology giants have revolutionized the way we access information and communicate with each other. Social media has the power to foster citizen activism, virally spread disinformation or hate speech, and shape political discourse. Government cannot avoid its responsibility to scrutinize this impact, and that's why I so welcome the activities of this committee and appreciate very much everything that you're doing, which has carryover effect in my country, even when we can't adopt our own regulations, when you all adopt regulations in other countries. Sometimes the platforms just maintain the same policies throughout the world. That helps us. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this event, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Weintraub. First of all, we'll go to Mr. Collins, Co-Chair.
Thank you very much. If I could just start my first question to Ellen Weintraub. You mentioned dark money in your opening statement. How concerned are you about the ability of campaigns to use technology, particularly blockchain technology, to launder impermissible donations into campaigns by turning them into multiple small micro donations?
Well, I'm very concerned about it, and in part because our entire system of regulation is based on the assumption that large sums of money are what we need to worry about, and that's where we should focus our regulatory activity. But on the internet, sometimes very small amounts of money can be used to have vast impact. And that doesn't even get into the possibility of Bitcoin and other technologies being used to entirely mask where the money is coming from. So, yes, I have deep concerns.
Have there been any particular examples of that which have come to the awareness of your commission?
Well, the problem with dark money is that you never really know who's behind it. There's been about $1 billion in dark money spent on our elections in the last 10 years, and I cannot tell you who's behind it. That's the nature of the darkness.
Yeah. I did wonder whether there have been any particular allegations that have been made or anything, whether there have been calls for any further investigation about what might be considered to be suspicious activity.
We have a constant stream of complaints about dark money. I think that the case that I just described to you is one of the foremost examples we've seen recently of money that comes in through, it could come in through LLCs or 501c4s. In this case, it came in through the domestic subsidiary of a foreign corporation.
Yeah. I mean, have you got any concern about the way technologies like PayPal could be used as well to bring money in from sources trying to hide their identity or even from abroad?
PayPal, gift cards, all of those things are deeply concerning. If the money is going directly to a campaign, they can't accept more than a small amount of money without disclosing the source of it. And they're not allowed to accept anonymous contributions of a very small amount of money. But once you get into the outside spending groups, super PACs, groups like that, they can accept money from corporations, and corporations are, by definition, a shield against knowing who's really behind them.
Thank you. Just a question, if I could direct to all, it'd be interesting in the comments of all three of the witnesses. Ad transparency seems to be one of the most important things we should push for. We've, certainly in the UK, and I think in other countries as well, our electoral law was based on understanding who the messenger was, people having to state who was paying for an advert and who the advert was there to promote. And those same rules didn't translate into social media. Even though the platforms are saying that they will require that transparency, I think particularly in the case of Facebook, it seems quite easy to game that the person who claims to be the person responsible for the ads may not be the person who is the data controller or the funder, and that information isn't really clear. And I wondered if you share our concerns about that, and if you have any thoughts about what sort of legislation we might need to make sure there is full, proper disclosure as to who is funding campaigns.
Well, I absolutely share that concern, and I think that part of the problem is they're not doing any, as far as I know, they're not verifying who's behind the ad. So if somebody says that Mickey Mouse is the sponsor of this ad, that's what they're going to run on their platform.
Sorry, I was checking something with the chairman there. I'd be interested in the other two panelists as well, whether they have a concern on how we would create a robust system of ad transparency online.
I would add that I think to reduce the risk of misuse of information in the political process, you need to have a series of laws. And in Canada and in a number of countries, I believe in the United States, political parties, at least federally in Canada, are not governed by privacy legislation. So that's another gap in the laws of certain countries. So you need a series of measures, including transparency in advertising, including data protection laws, and other rules to ensure that the ecosystem of companies and political parties are properly governed.
So it sounds like you would. The heart of it is having regulators who've got statutory powers to also go into the tech companies and investigate whether they feel the really appropriate information is being disclosed.
We can investigate companies in Canada, but we cannot investigate political parties, and I think a proper regime would authorize the regulator to have oversight over both.
Both parties and the platforms that are running the advertising?
Yes.
I don't know if the audio feed is working to Malta, but...
The audio feed is working. Thank you, Mr. Gomez. And I thank you also for the work that you've put in on your report, which I must say I found to be extremely useful for my mandate. Very quickly, I share the concerns of both the previous witnesses. The importance of who the messenger was is very, very great when it comes to ad transparency. I share serious concerns about use of blockchains and other distributed ledger technologies. And I think that, very frankly, not enough not enough research has been carried out at this moment in time to try and examine the issues concerned. I happen to live in a country which has proclaimed itself the blockchain island, and we have some effort going on with legislation on blockchain, but I'm afraid that there's still a lot of work to be done around the world on this subject, and I would suggest that if at all possible, the committee lends its name and to some serious resources in studying the problem and coming up with proper recommendations. I mean,
Thank you,
the
Mr.
questions that I get asked
Mr. Kanatachi,
all the time, I'm
we're
sorry.
over time and we have some members that are needing to go to vote, so I just need to get to Ms. Vanderbilt as soon as I can.
Thank you.
We'll try and get back
I'll stop.
around if you need a more fulsome answer. Ms. Vanderbilt.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for being here for your very informative testimony. I'd like to focus my questions on the foreign threats to democracy and what I call the enabling technologies, so the social media platforms, the dataopolies that are actually allowing for those foreign threats to actually take hold. And I note that as legislators, we are the front lines of democracy globally. Those of us who are elected representatives of the people, if we are not able to tackle this and do something about these threats, this is really up to us, and that's why I'm so pleased that the Grand Committee is meeting today. And I also note that the cooperation that even our committee was able to do with the UK committee on aggregate IQ, which was here in Canada when we were studying Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. But we do have a problem, which is that individual countries, especially smaller markets, are very easily ignored by these large platforms because simply, they're so large that individually there's not much we can do. So we do need to work together. So the first question that I have for you, Ms. Weintraub, is do you believe that right now you have the tools that you need to ensure that the 2020 U.S. election is going to be free of, or as free as possible, of foreign influence?
I hesitate to answer that question. As I said in my testimony, there are various laws that I wish Congress would pass. There are regulations that I wish I could persuade my colleagues on the Commission to agree to pass on the Commission. So I think that we are not in as good shape as we could be. But I do know that the Department of Homeland Security and all the state and local governments have been working very hard to ensure, as I said, the physical infrastructure to try and ensure that votes don't get changed, which of course is the biggest fear. But when it comes to foreign influence, well, as our FBI director said, we are expecting our adversaries to be changing up their game plan, and until we see it, we won't know whether we're ready for it.
Now, in Canada, one of the issues is during an election campaign, it's very hard to know who has that authority to be able to speak out. So we've put together the Critical Election Incident Public Protocol, which is a group of senior civil servants who would be able to make public, if it's known through the security agencies, that there is, in fact, a foreign threat. Is this something that has the U.S. looked at something like this? Is this something that you think would work internationally? And I'd actually ask Mr. Kanatachi to also answer that in terms of the global context. If you're seeing things that could potentially, during an election period, allow for that kind of authority to be able to speak out on that. So I'll start with Ms. Weintraub, and then I'll go to Mr. Kanatachi.
I do think that authority is there. I think that there are federal officials who are empowered to make that sort of information public if they become aware of it, as they become aware of it. There are obviously national security and intelligence concerns that sometimes hamper that kind of transparency.
And Mr. Kanatachi, is there, you mentioned that there are international treaties of sorts on data and privacy protection, but can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes, I can hear you.
Is there, I guess, a clearinghouse of sorts of international best practice on, because we're finding in this committee alone that there are very good examples that we're sharing, but is there any place where these best practices are being shared and tested and documented and disseminated?
Not to my knowledge. We have coming up two United Nations committees, which will, at least one of which may be discussing ancillary subjects. So there is the so-called open-ended working group inside UN, which will start working properly in the autumn, where you might be tempted to broach the subjects. I would, however, be pleased to work together with the committee in order to devise any sets of mechanisms which can be shared and good practices, because most of the attempts we have seen in manipulating elections involve profiling individuals in one way or another and then targeting them in order to get their votes. So I'd be very pleased to carry out work together with the committee in that direction, and anybody who wishes to share good practices is very welcome to do so.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Well, that's time. Yeah, so I appreciate that. We'll go over to Mr. Angus for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you for appearing. Ms. Weintraub, you Americans are like our first cousins, and we love you dearly. But we're a little smug because we look over the border and we see all this crazy stuff and we say we'd never do that in Canada. So I will give you the entire history of electoral fraud and interference in Canada in the last 10 years. We had a 20-year-old who was working for the Conservatives who got his hands on some phone numbers and sent out wrong information on voting day, and he was jailed. We had a member of this committee who got his cousins to help pay an electoral paying scheme, and he lost his seat in Parliament and went to jail. We had a cabinet minister who cheated on $8,000 worth of flights in an election and went over the limit, and he lost his position in cabinet and lost his seat. So these have consequences, and yet we see wide open data interference now where we don't have seeming any laws, or we're seeming at a loss and we're not sure how to tackle it. I can tell you that in 2015 I began to see it in the federal election, and it was not noticed at all in the national level. It was intense anti-Muslim, anti-women, immigrant that upended the whole election discourse in our region, and it was coming from Britain First, an extremist organization. How working class people in my region were getting this stuff, I didn't understand. But I understand now how fast the poison moves in the system, how easy it is to target individuals, how the profiles and the data profiles of our individual voters can be manipulated. So when the federal government has new electoral protection laws, it may be the greatest laws for 2015 election, but that's like stagecoach robberies compared to what we will see in our upcoming election, which will be probably testing some of the ground for the 2020 election. In terms of this massive movement in the tools of undermining democratic elections, how do we actually be able to have in place the tools to take on these data mercenaries who can target us right down to the individual voter with their own individual fears?
I don't even know how to begin to answer that question. I mean, obviously, Canada has a different system than we have in the United States. I don't always agree with the way our Supreme Court interprets the First Amendment, but they do have extremely strong protections for free speech rights, and that has ramifications in the area of technology and in the area of dark money, in the area of money in politics. If it were up to me, I think that they would veer a little bit more toward the Canadian model. But I don't have control over that.
Mr. Therrien, I will go to you. It was your predecessor, Elizabeth Denham, who identified the Facebook a weakness in 2008 and attempted to have them comply. If they had, we may have avoided so many issues. And now in 2019, we have you making a finding in the rule of law under your jurisdiction that Facebook broke our Information Protection Act. And what's been very disturbing is that Facebook has simply refused to recognize the jurisdiction of our country based on our supposed necessity to prove to them whether or not harm was impacted. I'm not sure if you heard Mr. Chan's testimony today, but in terms of the rights of democratic legislators to ensure that laws are protected, how do we address a company that believes that it can pick and choose, opt in or opt out over national laws?
So you refer to the findings of my predecessors 10 years ago. It's certainly disconcerting that practices that were identified 10 years ago and were said to have been corrected by better privacy policies, better information to users, were not actually corrected. There were superficial improvements in our view, but in effect, the privacy protections of Facebook 10 years after the investigation of the OPC 10 years ago were still very ineffective. On the jurisdictional argument, I believe the argument of the company is that because Canadians were not personally affected in terms of the ultimate misuse of the information for political purposes, that this somehow results in the lack of jurisdiction for my office. But actually what we looked at was not limited to the impact of these privacy practices on the Canadian political process. What we looked at was the sum total of the privacy regulatory scheme of Facebook as it applies not only to one third-party application, but all third-party applications, of which there are millions. So I'm certainly very concerned that Facebook is saying that we do not have jurisdiction when we were looking at the way in which Facebook handled the personal information of Canadians vis-a-vis millions of applications and not only one application. How do you ensure that Facebook or other companies heed to the jurisdiction of Canada? Well, certainly based on the legal regime that we have, we are left with the possibility, and that is what we will do, to bring Facebook to the Canadian Federal Court to have a ruling on Facebook's practices, including whether it is subject to our jurisdiction. We don't have much doubt that they are subject to our jurisdiction, but it will take a court finding to decide that question.
Okay, just
Thank
finally,
you, Mr. Angus. We're at time.
mine says 4 minutes 53 seconds.
We'll have some more time around the hop, so I better get going here. So we'll go up next to Singapore for 5 minutes, Mr. Tom.
Thank you. Ms. Weintraub, thank you very much for being here. In September 2017, you wrote to the then chairman of the FEC a letter, and I'll just quote one paragraph from it and ask you some questions. You said, "It is imperative that we update the Federal Election Commission's regulations to ensure that the American people know who is paying for the internet political communications they see." Now, am I right to assume that your concerns arise from the fact that foreign activity influences, interferes with, and even corrupts political communication, not just in an election, but in everyday life of people in a democratic society? And if left unchecked over time, such activity would seek to undermine institutions, the government, subvert elections, and ultimately destroy democracy. Would I be right to say that?
I share many of those concerns, and I worry deeply that what is going on is not just election-oriented, but is an attempt to sow discord, to sow chaos, and to undermine democracy in many countries.
In fact, would you agree that the typical modus operandi of such operators, bad actors, would be precisely to sow discord, socially divisive issues, to take up issues that split open fault lines in society, so that institutions and ultimately governments are undermined.
I believe that is so.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the tech companies, and I think you said the answer to you was, we've got this. And obviously it's far from it. And you also said that it's obvious that they were not verifying the persons behind the advertisements and the donations. Are you aware of the Campaign for Accountability, CFA?
I can't say that I am,
No.
sorry.
Sometime after Robert Mueller, and I think you explained Robert Mueller's findings, released his findings, a non-profit organization called Campaign for Accountability went to they posed as IRA operators, bought political ads, and they did so very easily, and they were able to effectively get Google to run a whole series of advertisements and campaigns for a little less than US $100. And they were able to manage to get something like 20,000 views and more than 200 clicks with that kind of spend. Now, is that something that would concern you? And should regulations deal with that kind of obvious foreign activity, which our social media platforms cannot be trusted to police?
I absolutely think that there is a need for greater regulation to ensure that when people see things on social media, that they can trust where it's coming from.
Yes. The regulations that you spoke of from the quote that I read to you, if you can, maybe in 30 seconds, tell us what you think should be the core principles behind such regulations to stop the influence and corruption of foreign interference in democratic processes.
Well, as I said, I think what we need is greater transparency. People need to be able to know when they're reading something online where it's coming from, because we had this example of ads being placed and information being placed, propaganda coming from the Internet Research Agency in Russia. And, I don't know anybody who wants to get their news from a Russian troll farm. I think that if they knew that's where it was coming from, that would tell them something about how much to believe it.
Yes, because ultimately false information is not free speech, isn't it?
Well, I think people need to know where the information is coming from,
Yes,
and then they can draw better conclusions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We'll go next to Ms. Naughton from Ireland.
My first question would be to Mr. Kanatashi. It's in relation to legislation we're looking at in Ireland, which could ultimately apply at a European level. It's an online digital safety commissioner, and one of the key challenges our committee is having in relation to drawing this legislation is that definition about what is harmful communication. And I don't know if you could assist us, or is there best practice or the best way of going about this, because we're, also legislating ultimately at a European level, and we need to, as we know, protect freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and those issues have been raised here. I don't know if you have any comments to make in relation to that.
Yes, thank you for the question. The short answer is yes, I would be happy to assist you. We are setting up a task force precisely on privacy and children and online harm. It's a very difficult subject, especially because some of the terminology which has been used is not very clear, including the use of words like age appropriate. The Irish kids I know are, like most of the kids around the world, in other words, there's no such thing of one age being associated to a given level of maturity. Kids develop at different ages, and the kind of harm which they can receive really needs to be better studied. In fact, there are very little studies, unfortunately, on the subjects. There are some studies, but not enough. And I would certainly welcome a joint European, Irish, and indeed international approach the subject, because this is something which goes across borders. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, and I think that's a common concern here around the table in relation to that definition. And just, I might ask the Privacy Commissioner, Mr. Therrien, just in relation to GDPR, if you have any sort of viewpoints on how that's working. And as you know, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg has called for GDPR to be rolled out on a global level. And just your own comments from your own professional background, what are your viewpoints? It is quite new. It's been rolled out at European level, as you know, but just your viewpoint on that, how it's working, and Mr. Zuckerberg's call for that to be rolled out, even on a modified level from country to country. Just your viewpoints.
Thank you. So the GDPR is still relatively new. So how is it working? I think we will need to wait a little bit further to see what is its impact in practice. I certainly believe that the principles of the GDPR are good principles. They're good practices. I believe that individual countries obviously should seek to have the most effective privacy and data protection possible and borrow from other jurisdictions rules that have that impact. I think it's also important, in addition to interoperability, which I mentioned in my opening statement, that the national laws, although interoperable and borrowing from good principles like, for instance, the GDPR, are also aligned and informed by the culture and traditions of each country. So there might be differences in certain jurisdictions, say on the various weight or the relative weight of freedom of expression versus data protection. But as a starting point, I think GDPR is an excellent starting point.
Okay, thank you. I think they're really my questions. I don't know. Could I have how much time left? Yeah. Do you want to ask one brief question?
Thanks, Chair. If it's okay, I'll just use up the last minute, but I'll come in on the second round again if that's
Yeah, you bet.
for my 5 minutes.
Yep.
Just, Ms. Weinrab, just interesting listening to your analysis of what happened in recent elections and I suppose particularly nation states' influence. And one thing I think that's common, it's not necessarily that they favour one candidate over another, but it seems to be a common theme they favour dissent and I suppose weakening Western democracies. I think we saw that arguably in Brexit as well as in the US elections. So I guess how do we combat that? And I've drafted legislation similar to the Honest Ads Act, the Social Media Transparency Act, but very, very similar objectives. And one question, I'll come back to this in the second round, but in terms of how do we actually enforce that type of legislation, and is the onus on the publishers or is it on the platform? So if somebody's running, we heard somebody mention that they had successfully ran fake ads from the 160 US senators or members of the House of Representatives or whatever it was, but so should it be the platforms who are liable for ensuring that the correct disclosure and disclaimers and verification is performed? Or as they say back to us, they say, well, we can't possibly do that. So do we make the people who are running the ads liable, or do we make the people that are taking the ads liable, if you understand the distinction?
Historically, what we do in the States is the onus is on whoever's placing the ads to make sure that their disclaimers and disclosure obligations are fulfilled. But, I mean, it seems to me that we could take advantage of the vaunted machine learning, AI capabilities of these platforms if the machines can detect that the name on the ad bears no relation at all to the source of the payment. I think maybe they could have a human being take a look at that and say, hey, let's just make sure we got the right name here on the ad.
Yeah. Sure.
It's not the way our laws work right now, though.
Sure. Okay, thank you.
For 5 minutes, Mr. Zimmerman from Germany. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would first start with Mr. Catanacci and would focus on international cooperation. we brought it up earlier here that on an international level, cooperation is needed because this is also the idea behind our meeting here. But where do you see forums for cooperation in these areas? Is, for example, we'll have the Internet Governance Forum, which is a multi-stakeholder approach on UN level this year in Germany, or do you see any other approaches?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Zimmerman. The Internet Governance Forum is a useful place to meet and talk, but we must be very careful not to let it remain just a talking shop. So the problem is that it is a forum where a lot of interesting ideas are heard, but where very little governance takes place. And at this moment in time, the states, unfortunately, tend to dodge the responsibility of providing actual governance. I think what we're going to see, and I think that the companies feel this coming, some of them have admitted it, I think what you're going to see is countries getting together, but including the European Parliament, which has just been elected, etc., increasingly using measures which will focus attention. And nothing focuses attention like money. So the GDPR approach, which has been referred to, has got companies around the world paying close attention, because nobody wants to be stuck with a bill of 4% of the global turnover.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the measures which will help introduce liability and responsibility. And to go to the previous question, I think it will also focus attention on platforms at least as much as publishers, because, as has been said, sometimes it's difficult to detect whether the publisher was the right person.
Thank you very much. I had the enforcement question would have been my follow-up, but you already answered. Thank you. I would also ask one question to Mr. Weintraub. We mentioned a lot of times now trolls and troll farms, and we're focusing very much on advertisements. But what about homegrown trolls? So we've seen that up to a certain degree also in Germany, that especially on the far right, they have activists which are really trolls on steroids. So you don't have to pay them. They do that because they want to support their political affiliates, but they are also using tools where they in the dark they're deciding, okay, we are focusing on that member of parliament, attacking him or her, or we're simply supporting every post done by a member of that party, and they are simply making the most out of the algorithms, and they don't need any money for it. So do you have also that on the radar?
I think you raise another very serious question, and we have seen that in the States, where some of the techniques that were pioneered by foreign activists are now being adopted by domestic activists because they've seen that they work.
Yeah.
And it has the same kind of concerning effect of promoting discord and hate speech sometimes, and gathering from the crevices of the community people who have views that in isolation might not have much power, but when they are able to find each other online and promote these ideas, they become a lot more concerning. And we don't have as good tools to go after that, because it's easy to say, well, if it's foreigners who are trying to intervene in our election, well, we know that's not a good thing. But when it's our own people, that's a bigger challenge.
Maybe one last aspect. I mean, we have also on the media, we have a lot of regulation, what is allowed for a TV station, for a radio station. But in Germany right now, we have a lot of debate about YouTuber. So active people who are basically having more audience than many TV stations, but are not regulated at all. Is that something you're also having seen?
Well, we certainly have the phenomenon of influencers, and I have to say I don't spend a lot of time on YouTube myself, and when I see some of these folks. I really am not sure why they have this kind of influence and sway, but they do. And again, it goes back to the model that we have. The model of regulation in the United States is a money-based model. So when we began to address political activity on the internet, it was at a point when YouTube was in its infancy, and the governing assumption was, well, of course, somebody would have to pay to put these ads up in order for anybody to see them. And now we're dealing in a whole different world where all this free content is up there and it goes viral, and there are very few controls on that.
Thank you. We're going to get back to our parliamentarians now that they've returned from votes, so we'll go to Mr. Kent for 5 minutes.
Right, thank you, Chair. My first question is for Commissioner Therrien, and related to the revelation in the government's response to the order paper question regarding discriminatory advertising for employment on a number of platforms, it seems, but certainly Facebook was mentioned, that a number of departments had requested micro-targeting advertising by sex and age. Mr. Chan, the CEO of Facebook Canada, responded that yes, that was the case. Protocols have changed, although there was a certain imprecision or ambiguity in his responses. And he said that the Government of Canada has been advised that it is not only unacceptable, but quite possibly illegal under various human rights legislation across the country. I wonder if I could have your response, Commissioner.
I think this shows the importance of having regulations that are human rights based. Here we have a practice that allegedly resulted or could result in discrimination. And I think it's important that the regulations look at the net effect of a practice and deal with it from a human rights perspective. So in terms of privacy, we tend to look at privacy or data protection as rules around consent and purpose specification and so on and so forth. I think Cambridge Analytica raised the issue of the relationship, the close relationship between privacy protection, data protection, and the exercise of fundamental rights, including, in the case of your example, equality rights. And I think that for the types of laws for which I'm responsible in Canada, to define privacy not by regard to important mechanisms like consent, for instance, but by regard to the rights, the fundamental rights that are protected by privacy, we would have a more effective and more fulsome protection.
Okay. A question for you, Ms. Weintraub, and the discussion that we had with Facebook this morning with regard to the Pelosi altered video and the statement that Facebook made to the Washington Post saying, we don't have a policy that the information you post on Facebook must be true. Clearly, this is a case of political maliciousness. It is not an election year, but certainly it is tainting the well of democracy with regards to and obviously targeting one political leader's reputation and political leadership. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are with regards to the Facebook argument that they will take down a video by someone posting the truth who is falsely posting, but they will leave up the video placed by someone who is obviously quite willing to say that they put the video up and simply to put an advisory that it doesn't seem to be the truth, even though in the Pelosi case, that manipulated video has been seen by many millions of viewers since the controversy developed, which again feeds the business plan of Facebook with regards to clicks and number of views.
Well, I I heard a lot of dissatisfaction this morning voiced about the answer that Facebook gave, and I have to say that I also found their answer to be somewhat unsatisfactory. But it raises a really important question as to, I mean, in this case, they know it's not true, but the broader question is, who is going to be the arbiter of truth? Personally, I don't want that responsibility, and I think that it's dangerous when government takes on that responsibility of deciding what is true and what isn't, and that really veers more into the Orwellian or more authoritarian governments. I don't think that I would feel comfortable either being that person or living in that regime where government had that power. But if government doesn't have that power, then the question is who does? Because I'm also uncomfortable with the platforms having that much power over determining what is truth and what isn't.
But if that were to occur in an election cycle, what would your response be?
Well, in election cycles, you know, we have various regulations that govern ads, if indeed it is paid advertising, and if it mentions candidate names. So, you know, every member of the House of Representatives runs every 2 years. I suppose for a member of the House of Representatives, they're always in cycle, but we have stronger rules that govern once we get closer to the election. So within 30 days of a primary or 60 days of a general election, there are rules, again, that go to disclosure, though. We don't have any rules that would empower my agency to order a platform to take down an ad.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Weintraub. So just to alert you, some of the memberships of the committee are not going to ask questions, so we have a bit more time than you might expect. So if you do want to ask another question, please just signal the chair and I'll add you in at the end of the sequence. Okay, so next up we have a member from Estonia. Go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Weintraub, question for you. Disinformation is officially part of Russia's military doctrine, and has been so for some times already. They are using it as a strategy to divide West, basically. And it is also known that Russia actually uses 1.1 billion euros per year for their propaganda and spreading their narratives. Your next presidential elections are practically tomorrow. And knowing the things we know now, about the last campaigning period. Are you ready today? If all this, what happened during the previous campaign, will reappear, and if all the same things would happen again, do you think now you will be able to solve it?
I'm not going to claim that I can personally
US
solve the problem of disinformation in our elections. As I mentioned earlier, I think there are laws and regulations that have been drafted and should be adopted that would strengthen our position. I also think that we writ large, need to devote more attention to digital literacy. A lot of people believe all sorts of things that they see online that they really shouldn't. And my daughter tells me this is generational, that her generation is much more skeptical of what they read online, and that it's only my foolish generation that that views the internet as this novelty and assumes that everything that they read is true. I don't know that I entirely agree that it's entirely a generational problem, but I do think that we, as a whole, as the broader community of democracies, really need to look into what our resiliency is to the kinds of disinformation that we know is going to be out there. And as I said, we're always fighting the last battle, so we can write laws to address what happened last time, but I'm quite sure that new techniques are going to be developed in the next election that nobody's even thinking about yet.
Can you say what are the two worst or the main threats you are preparing for?
Well, my agency is all about regulating money in politics. That's that is our focus. So we are trying to look at where the money is coming from. That is what we're always looking at, and we're trying to get better transparency measures in place so that our voters and our electorate will better know where the money is coming from and who's trying to influence them. That's really my number one priority.
And 2
minutes.
2 minutes, okay. We just had elections in Europe, European Parliament election. Do you see that something we went through can be useful to prepare for your next elections? Or how closely do you cooperate with European colleagues?
I'm always happy to get information from any source. It's why I'm here. It's a very educational event for me, as well as I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have.
But do you see already that there are some things from the European Parliament elections that that you can see useful?
We have not yet studied what went on in the
Okay.
European Parliament elections.
All right.
You're good? Okay, thank you. We're going to go up to, we're going to start the cycle again, just so you know. So we'll start with Nate, then we'll go down to the next parliamentarian. So it's Nate, Ian, James. Okay, go ahead, Nate.
Thanks very much. So I was in Brussels recently, and I met with the EU Data Protection Supervisor, and there is great cooperation among the privacy commissioners in the EU. And I know there are conferences of privacy commissioners where you get together and you discuss these issues as a matter of cooperation amongst regulators. Is there the same level of cooperation, Ms. Weintraub, with respect to elections?
Our elections are run under our own unique rules. So as I said before, happy to have information from any source, but because our rules are different than other countries, particularly when it comes to the transparency of money in politics and how we fund our elections, we kind of plow our own course.
Sure, yeah. When I suggested I want to get involved in politics to a friend from Colorado and a friend from Mississippi, and I said that the cap in my local district was 100,000 Canadian dollars, they laughed at me for a long time.
It's very different.
Before I move to Mr. Tarrant, I want to as an American here, I completely respect you have stronger free speech rules than we have here in Canada. Still, when you say arbiters of truth, there are still standards councils, and there are still, when it comes to broadcasters, surely a broadcaster in an election, maybe I'm incorrect, but I would expect there are standards councils that there were some ethical guidelines that they abide by and some basic principles that they would abide by, and they wouldn't just broadcast anything.
Well, I think that's true of broadcasters mostly out of a sense of professional responsibility, and that is one of the conundrums that I think we all face, that when we were living in a world where there were a small number of broadcasters, and those were all professional journalists, and they had training, and they exercised editorial control over what they were distributing, and were doing a lot of fact-checking. That's a whole different world from the information that we get online, where everybody's a broadcaster, everyone is a content producer.
But so sort of, right? Because it's one thing for you and I to be friends on Facebook and you post something and I see it. It's a very different thing if the news feed, the algorithm that Facebook employs, makes sure I see it because of a past history that I have online, or that the YouTube recommendation function ensures that I see a video that I wouldn't see otherwise because I didn't seek it out. And aren't they very akin to a broadcaster when they're employing algorithms to make sure I see something and they're increasing impressions and reach?
Well, you're discussing an entirely different topic. I was talking about individuals who are putting their own content out there. But the way that the platforms are regulated on under current United States law is that they don't have those same responsibilities as broadcasters under Section 230. That
if they took their corporate social responsibility seriously as broadcasters do, presumably they would, they would join a standards council or create one. With respect to ad transparency, we've recommended at this committee, I mean, the Honest Ads Act would be a good start, but I think it would just be a first step.
Absolutely.
Does it make sense to you that if I'm receiving an ad online, especially in an election, that I would be able to click through and see who paid for it, obviously, but also the demographics for which I've been targeted, and the selection criteria on the back end that the advertiser has selected, whether it's Facebook or Google, whatever it might be. If it's been directed to a particular postal code, for example, or it's because I'm between the ages of 25 and 35. Do you agree that there should be more detailed transparency?
I do, but of course part of the problem with that, though, is that very few people would actually click through to find that information. So one concern that I have is everybody says, well, as long as you can click through and find the information somewhere, that should be good enough. I think there has to be some information right on the face of the ad that tells you where it's coming from.
The last question I have is for you, Mr. Tarian. We had a number of excellent witnesses last night and this morning who really highlighted the business model as the fundamental problem here, that it encourages this never-ending accumulation of data. And I wonder if you have any comments on an idea. I want to set two ideas out. One is how do we address that business model problem that was identified? And two, how do we address it in such a way that also respects the real value of aggregate level data in different ways? So if I look at Statistics Canada, for example, that publishes aggregate level data that is really helpful for informed public policy. When I use Google Maps on a daily basis, that is based upon user information that is fed into the system, and as a result, I don't need to know where I'm going all the time, and I can use Google Maps, and it's based on data that has been input, but in the public interest. And so how do you how do we address the business model, but also protect the public interest use of aggregate level data?
So I think an important part of the solution is to look at the purposes for which the information is collected and used. It's one thing for an organization, a company, to collect and use data to provide a direct service to an individual that is totally legitimate, and this is the type of practice that should be allowed. It's another for an organization to collect so much information, perhaps under the guise of some type of consent, that the end outcome is something very close to corporate surveillance. So I think it's important to distinguish between the two. And so there are a number of technical rules that are at play, but the idea that we should define privacy beyond mechanical issues like consent and so on and so forth, and define it by regard to what is the right being protected, i.e. the freedom to engage in the digital economy without fear of being surveilled, is an important part of the solution.
Thanks. I'll just say one final thing. It's a curious thing when you think of privacy from a consumer protection perspective, that when I buy this phone, I don't have to read the terms and conditions, and I know that if it's a defective phone, I can take it back, because I don't there are implied warranties that protect me. But every app I use on my phone, in order to be protected, I have to read the terms and conditions. I think it's just a crazy thing. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So I just wanted to speak to the order. This is what I have. I have Ian, James, Graham, Joe, Jacques, Charlie, and Peter. That's what I have. And to close out, we have Mr. Collins again for some final words. And that's what we have so far. If there's anybody left that wants to ask a question, please put your hand up and I'll try and get you on and add it to that list, but it looks like we're tight for time. Next of all, we'll go up to Mr. Lucas for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was very struck by something that Jim Balsillie said this morning, which he said the online business model of the platforms subverts choice. And choice is what democracy is essentially about. And it occurred to me that you might find this quite amusing, but in the United Kingdom, broadcasters aren't allowed to do political advertising. In other words, we don't have the wonderful advertisements that I've seen in the United States, and I'm sure other jurisdictions. It occurred to me, do you think there's a case for banning paid-for political advertising online on these platforms?
I don't see any way it would pass constitutional scrutiny on our Supreme Court.
That's in the United States.
Yep. It's my frame of reference.
Yeah. I just wonder whether is the use of political advertising through broadcasting, is that something, if I can talk to Mr. Kanatachi, is that worldwide nowadays? Are there other jurisdictions where broadcast advertisements are not accepted?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Lucas. The answer is that national practices vary. Some countries go more towards the United States model, others go towards the United Kingdom model. And in truth, though, we are finding that in many countries where the law is more restrictive, in practice, many individuals and political parties are using social media to get around the law in a way which was not properly envisaged in some of the actual legislation. I'd like to take the opportunity, once I've been asked a question, to refer to something which I think is transversal across all the issues we have here, with the Chair's permission. And that goes back to the question, to the statement made by Ms. Weintraub, which is, who is going to be the architect of truth? Who's going to be the arbiter of truth? And in a number of countries, that value is still very close to our hearts. It is a fundamental human right, which happens to reside in the same Article 17 of the International Covenant of Human Rights, of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, of which many, if not all, of the countries around the table are members of. In the same section which talks about privacy, we have the provision of reputation. People, when you carry out research, care a lot about their reputation. So the arbiter of truth, essentially in many countries, including France, I believe there was some discussion in Canada too, people are looking at having an arbiter of truth. Call him the Internet Commissioner, call him the Internet Ombudsman, call him what you will, but in reality, people want a remedy. And the remedy is you want to go to somebody who is going to take things down if something is not true. And we've got to remember, and this applies also to online harm, including radicalization, that a lot of the harm which is done on the internet is done in the first 48 hours of publication. So timely takedown is a key practical remedy. And in many cases, while freedom of speech should be respected, privacy and reputation are best respected by timely takedown. And then if the arbiter concerned in the jurisdiction deems that something was unfairly taken down, it can go back out. But otherwise, we need a remedy. Thank you.
It just occurs to me that, going back to Mr. Erskine-Smith's point, when I joined Facebook, I didn't consent to agree to be targeted by political advertising from anywhere. I didn't know that was part of the deal. And it's not why people join Facebook. And it seems to me that we've managed to, give or take a few bad phases, survive as a democracy in the UK without broadcast TV adverts, political adverts. So we're not suppressing. It's a particular area of advertising that I'm seeking to restrict, and I'm supported because of the emphasis that was given this morning to the way that the control of data is really removing choice from the individual in this process. I mean, from an information regulation point of view, how clear do you think people are in that area? Do you think people understand that that's what's happening here?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think there are many people in the United States who would love a system where they didn't get political advertisements. It's not something that people actually enjoy all that much. But I think you're raising a nuance there that I think is important, and that is it's not our Supreme Court would never allow sort of a flat-out ban on political
I know
advertising.
the position of the United States, but
right. But what you're talking about is the use of people's personal data to micro-target them, and that, it seems to me, does raise a very different issue. So I'm not actually sure that wouldn't pass constitutional scrutiny.
That's exactly what's happening in terms of paid-for advertising at the moment. The other issue, then I'd like to pick up...
Mr. Lucas, if you can make it real quick. I hate to
very
cut you off.
quickly,
You've come a long way.
Pick up an issue that Jen's mentioned. He talked about trolls. Closed groups are also a massive problem in that we do not have the information. And I think we need to concentrate more on that as an issue too.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. Next up, we have James from Ireland.
Thank you, Chair. And I have a couple more questions and observations. Just picking up on something that I think was Mr. Nathie was saying earlier, just a general point, and I suppose that often the question comes up whether these platforms are legally, whether they're publishers or whether they're kind of dumb hosts, which is kind of just a terminal that displays the content that gets put in front of them. And I think one argument to support the fact that they're publishers and therefore have greater legal responsibilities is that they have moderators and moderation policies, and the people making live decisions about what should and shouldn't be shown, on top, of course, of the targeting algorithms. So I think that's something that's of interest, or just an observation. The other point, just before getting into questions, just we're talking about nation states and we're talking about different hostile acts, and one thing that's topic at the moment is the I suppose the most recent revelation in terms of the Chinese government and the Huawei ban, and the fact that Google, I think in the last few days, announced a ban on Huawei handsets or supporting Huawei handsets. But it strikes me that Google are tracking us through Google Maps and everything else as we walk about with their phones. I think I read the 72 million different data points in a typical year consumed just by walking about town with the phone in your hand or in your pocket. So maybe the difference is that Google have somewhere terms and conditions which we're supposed to tick, and Huawei don't, but both are effectively doing the same thing, allegedly. So that's just a thought on that. Just on the legislative framework, again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been trying to draft some legislation to tackle some of this akin to the Honest Ads Act. One of the issues we come across, one of the challenges is balancing free speech with, I suppose, voter protection, protecting our democracies. And I'm always loath to criminalise certain behaviours, but I'm wondering what the tipping point is. And I suppose the way I've kind of drafted it initially, the way I've considered it is that I think that you can post whatever you want as long as you're transparent about who actually said it, or who's behind it, or who's running it, who's paying for it, particularly if it's a commercial, if it's a paid for post. But in terms of the bots and the fake accounts, and what I would call the industrial scale fake accounts, where we have a bot farm or where we have multiple hundreds or thousands of users, which are actually being manipulated by maybe a single user or a single entity for their own ends, I think that probably strays into the criminal space. So I suppose that's one question for Ms. Wenrab. And I suppose another question, related question, is, because it's something we struggle with in Ireland, and I guess many jurisdictions might struggle with, who is responsible for policing these areas? So is it an electoral commission? If so, is it, does the electoral commission have its own powers of enforcement, powers of investigation? Do you have law enforcement resources available to you? Is it the plain and simple police force of the state? Is it, as an Ireland, we have a data protection commissioner in the mix as well. We different types of regulators, but it can be a bit of an alphabet soup, and it can be difficult to actually pin down who's in charge. And then if we do have somebody in charge, it can be difficult. They don't always have the resources to follow through on it. So that's my first question in terms of, I suppose, criminalisation. Is that a bridge too far, and where do you draw the line? And secondly, if there is criminalisation and there's investigations required, what kind of resourcing do you have, or do you think is needed?
Well, again, I can. My expertise is in the U.S. system, so I can most effectively tell you about that. We are a law enforcement agency. Okay. We have jurisdiction over money in politics, and we have civil enforcement authority. We have subpoena authority. We can do investigations. I think that some of our enforcement tools could be strengthened. But we also have the ability to refer to our Justice Department if we think there are criminal violations, which is basically knowing and willful violations of the law. And going back to something that you said earlier, in terms of our regulatory system, I don't think bots have First Amendment rights. They're not people. So I don't have any problem with I don't understand why these smart tech companies can't detect the bots and get them off the platforms. And I don't think that would raise First Amendment concerns because they're not people.
That's a great line. I'm going to use that again myself. My next question, I think I'm still in time. Another way around this that we've seen in Ireland, and I guess I think around the world, we've heard it again today, because of the avalanche of fake news and disinformation, there's a greater onus on supporting the, dare I say, traditional platforms. So news media, what we'd call independent quality news media. There is a difficulty in terms of who decides what's independent and what's quality. But one of the approaches that we've been looking at, and I think I heard it in the Canadian Parliament when we were watching Question Time a few hours ago, I heard similar debates. One solution we're toying with is the idea of giving sort of state subsidy, state sponsorship to independent media, not to any particular news organisation, but to maybe a broadcasting committee or a sort of fund that is available to Indigenous current affairs coverage, independent coverage. That could be online, or could be in broadcast media, or could be in the print media. But it's a way to promote and sustain the traditional fourth estate and the traditional, checks and balances of democracy, but in a way that's, I suppose, that has integrity and is supported and asks questions of us all, but as a kind of foil to the fake news that's doing the rounds. But it's a difficult one to get right, because who decides who's worthy of sponsorship and who's worthy of subsidy and who isn't? But I guess if you can present as a bona fide, legitimate local platform, you should be entitled to. But just that's an approach we're exploring. I'm wondering, has it worked elsewhere, or has it seemed to work in other jurisdictions?
Thank you. Thank you, James. Next up, we'll go to Graham. Go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Ms. Weintraub, to build on that, if bots don't have First Amendment rights, why does money?
Well, money doesn't have First Amendment rights. It's the people who are spending the money that have First Amendment rights. And let me be clear about this. I'm not a big fan of our Supreme Court jurisprudence. I mean, I would adopt the Canadian jurisprudence on this stuff if I could, but it's a little bit above my pay grade.
Fair enough. So you don't necessarily think Citizens United was a good decision?
It would be fair to say that I'm not a fan of the Citizens United decision.
Fair enough. As you're saying, the Elections Commission's job is to oversee the financing of elections. So I'm wondering if a company knowingly permits the use of its algorithm or platform to influence the outcome of an election, knowingly, would you consider that to be a regulated non-monetary contribution?
I think it could be an in-kind contribution.
Interesting. So next question related to that is, the CEO of Facebook has majority voting shares in the company, has basically absolute power within that company. What, from a legal regulatory point of view, prevents that company from deciding to support or act in any way they feel like in an election?
As a corporation, it can't give a donation directly to a candidate. So, that would include an in-kind contribution. So the question that was raised earlier, and forgive me, I can't recall if it was you who suggested it, that the concern about Mark Zuckerberg running for president and using all of the information that Facebook has accumulated to support his campaign, that would be a massive campaign finance violation, because he doesn't own that information. Facebook, the corporation, owns it. Now, the wrinkle in that is that due to the decision of our Supreme Court, corporations can make contributions to super PACs. They can't make contributions that are supposedly acting independently of the campaigns. So if a super PAC were to be advancing the interests of a particular candidate, a corporation, including Facebook, could make an unlimited contribution to that super PAC to help them with their advocacy.
I understood. I don't have much time, so I'm going to go to Mr. Tzerian for just a quick second. To Mr. Lucas's point earlier, in the social media world, are we the client or are we the product?
It is often said that when you do not pay with money, that you are the product, and there is certainly a lot of truth to that phrase.
So when a surveillance-based company adds tags to sites that do not belong to them with the approval of the site owner, for example, Google Analytics is pervasive across the internet, they have the approval of the site owner but not of the end user. Or do you consider them to have implied consent to collect that data?
Sorry, I did not get the end.
If I have a website and I have Google Analytics on it, I've approved Google's use of my website to collect data, but somebody coming to use my website doesn't know that Google's collecting data on my site. So is there implied consent, or is that illegal, your point of view?
It is one of the flaws of consent, probably, that there is a term and condition somewhere that makes this consent. And that's why I say that privacy is not only about rules on consent, it's about the use of the information and the respect for rights. So we should not be fixated on consent as the be-all and end-all of privacy and data protection.
Thank you. So we have Mr. Picard will share the
very
rest of the
shortly,
time. Mr. Gray.
Ms. Weintraub, you just said something very interesting, and I just don't know whether we have established this notion before. In the scenario where Zuckerberg would run as president, Facebook couldn't give the information because it would be a massive contribution in kind. We established the ownership of the information because no one has consented that this information be spread, and therefore does Facebook own this information?
That is a very interesting question, but I'm not sure it's a campaign finance question, so it may be outside of my expertise.
What if it was in Canada, Mr. Tellier?
The rules around ownership of information are not very clear. So from a privacy and data protection perspective, I think the question is one of control, consent, but ownership is not a clearly cut question in Canada.
Thank you. So the last three, so we have Joe, Jacques, and Charlie, and then we'll finish up.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Weintraub, I wanted to ask you, as someone with an obvious professional and interest and expertise in this area, do you think we in the UK would have more confidence in our integrity in elections and referenda if we had a Mueller-type inquiry into the 2016 European Union referendum?
You know your people better than I do. I think you're a better judge of what would give them greater confidence. There were specific incidents that triggered the Mueller inquiry.
Mm-hmm. And do you see any overlap between those incidences or any trend in terms of what happened there and what you know about the European Union referendum?
I haven't studied it carefully enough to wage an opinion.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the future for us, we potentially have a second referendum coming up soon. We may have another vote. We may even have a general election very shortly. Are there any recommendations that you would make in terms of foreign interference through money to the UK and to our government? Because at the moment, our electoral laws, I think, are generally accepted to be unfit for purpose in the digital age.
Well, as I said, I think a lot of it goes to transparency. Do you have the ability to know who's behind the information that you're seeing, both digitally and in other media?
And are there any jurisdictions that you would identify currently as having really good electoral law that's fit for purpose, bearing in mind what we've all been talking about today around digital and interference? Is there a country that you would hold up as a really good model?
I keep looking for that. I go to international conferences and I'm hoping that somebody out there has the perfect solution. But I have to say I haven't found it yet. But if you find it, let me know, because I would love to find that country that's figured this out.
Okay, and perhaps I could ask Mr. Kanataki the same question about whether there's a jurisdiction that you're aware of that you think we could all look to for best practice on electoral law encompassing the digital age.
The short answer is no. I share Ms. Weintraub's problem. I keep looking for the perfect solution, and I only find, at best, half-baked attempts. But Ms. Stevens will stay in touch about the matter, and the minute we find something, I'll be very happy to share it.
Thank you.
2 minutes, Joe. Do you still? That's good.
Done.
Okay. Next up, we have Mr. Gord. Go ahead for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to focus on a word that seemed important to me, this issue of accountability or liability. This morning when we heard from the platforms, they seem to be casting aside that responsibility in some way that they have. I was shocked by this. I think they are responsible given their platform as to the services they offer. They were unable to prove to us, despite our very specific questions, that they have control over their platform in terms of fake news, hate propaganda that is being conveyed that could really change the course of things and influence many people. Those users who buy advertisements also have responsibility. They should be accountable and have accurate information out there. If one day we were to have legislation, perhaps even internationally, and some regulations, how should we determine the responsibilities of those parties, those platforms, and those users in order to ensure a proper monitoring the situation? I don't know if anyone has an answer to that.
Peut-être commencer d'un point.
As to data protection or privacy issues, I think you're pointing to a concept which is quite fundamental, this issue of accountability. Again, when we're talking about data protection in a world where data collection is on a massive scale and where the use of data by companies serves a number of purposes other than the primary purpose for which the information was available, companies tell us, rightfully so in part, that the consent model is not effective to protect privacy. And their suggestion is to replace consent when it is ineffective by greater accountability for these companies. I think that solution, that proposal, should come along with a true demonstration that these companies are accountable, that they're not just saying they are accountable. For those regulatory agencies, that would be a way of making sure that these companies really are accountable.
Well, it seems to me that they are occupying sort of a hybrid space. They say they're not broadcasters. They say they're just, the platform and they're not responsible for any of the content. And yet they do seem to feel that they have some responsibility because they are taking steps. Now, people may feel that the steps are inadequate, but they are taking some steps to provide greater transparency. Why are they doing that? I think it's because they know they can't quite get away with just ignoring this entire issue. They do bear some responsibility in a sort of in a broader sense, if not in a particular legal sense in any particular jurisdiction. And whether they would have stronger responsibilities if particular jurisdictions, either on an individual basis or on a global basis, decided to say, no, you really are broadcasters and you have to start acting like it. That is a question for legislators, not regulators.
Existe-t-il dans ce monde? Allez-y.
Go ahead.
Merci. Alors, je partage tout à fait l'avis de...
Unfortunately, this is inaudible to the interpreters.
See, if I could quickly just point out one thing, which is to say, whoever is going to control whether something should be taken down or not, whether it's true or not, whatever, that requires effort, that requires resources. Resources need to be paid for. Who's collecting the money? It's largely the companies. So while, of course, if you have somebody whom you can genuinely say, okay, this was the party or the sponsor or whoever who paid for the ad, but otherwise, when push comes to shove, I think we're going to see a growing argument and growing agreement between lots of jurisdictions which say we think that the companies are collecting the money, therefore they have the means in order to control things. We've seen that to be the case when, for example, Facebook needed to have people who spoke the language of Myanmar in order to be able to control hate speech in that country. And I think we're going to see an increasing lead in many national jurisdictions and eventually probably international agreement of attributing accountability, responsibility and fiscal liability for what goes on the platforms to the people who collect the money, which is normally the platforms themselves in a large extent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Last up, we'll go to Mr. Angus for 5 minutes. Actually, Mr. Collins following you, and then myself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We heard an extraordinary statement from Google today that they voluntarily stopped spying on our emails in 2017. And they did that in such a magnanimous manner, but they wouldn't agree not to spy on us in the future because there may be nifty things they can do with it. I find that our committee, and I can't even remember 2016, it's so long ago. 2018 changed our lives forever. But I remember we were looking at consent and whether the consent things should be clearer or they should be bigger. They should be less gobbledygook. I don't ever remember giving Google consent to spy on my emails or my daughter's emails when they were underage. I don't ever remember that it came up on my phone that if I wanted to use, put my tracking location on so I could find an address, that they could permanently follow me wherever I went and knew whatever I did. I don't remember giving Google on any search engine the consent to track every single thing I do. And yet, as legislators, I think we've been suckered and suckered. While we all talked about what was consent and what consumers can opt in on, and hey, if you don't like the service, don't use it. Like, Mr. Tarian, you said something very profound the last time you were here, which is the right of citizens to live free of surveillance. To me, this is where we need to bring this discussion. I think this discussion of consent is so 2016. And I think we have to say they have no consent to obtain this, that if there's not a reason, they can't have it. And that should be the business model that we move forward on, that the protection of privacy, the protection of our rights, opt in, opt out, to me, I couldn't trust them on anything on this. So I would like to ask you, we've heard from Mr. Basili, Ms. Zuboff, a number of experts today and yesterday. Is it possible in Canada, with our little country of 30 million people, to put in a clear law that says you can't gather personal information unless there's an expressed clear reason? It seems to me that that's part of what's already in PIPEDA, our information privacy laws, but to have it made very clear with very clear financial consequences for companies that ignore that. Can we actually make decisions on behalf of our citizens and our private rights?
So, of course, the answer to that is yes. I think there is a role for consent in certain circumstances where the relationship is bilateral between a company, service provider, and a consumer, where the consumer understands the information that is required to provide the service. But with the current digital economy, we're way beyond that, and there are many purposes for which the information is then used, often with the purported consent of the consumer. So while there is a place for consent, it has its limits, and that's why I say that it is important that privacy legislation define privacy for what it is. It is not at all limited to the mechanical question of consent. It is a fundamental right linked to other fundamental rights. And when the outcome of a practice of a company, despite purported consent, is to surveil a consumer in terms of data localization, in terms of the content of messages given by that person, then I think the law should say consent or not consent, it doesn't matter. What is at play is a privacy violation, being the surveillance of the individual in question, and that is a violation per se that should lead to penalties, significant penalties.
Thank you.
And it is possible to do that.
My final question is on facial recognition technology. Story in the Toronto Star today, the police are using facial recognition technology. San Francisco has attempted to ban it in other jurisdictions, or at least put a pause. The right of a citizen to be able to walk in a public square without being surveilled, without having to bring photo ID. Facial recognition technology changes all that. There are obviously legitimate uses. For example, if someone's on a CCTV camera and has committed a crime and there's a database, we would maybe have judicial oversight that that's a fair use. However, a number of people in a crowd that you can just gather in, and I'm sure Facebook and Google would be more than helpful because they have such a massive facial recognition databases on us. As a Canadian regulator, do you believe that we need to hit a pause button on facial recognition technology? How do we actually put the rules in place to protect citizen rights with clear safeguards for police use and for commercial use prior to abuses?
I think in terms of moratoria or outright prohibitions, I would distinguish between the use of a technology, so the technology of facial recognition, and the uses to which the technology is put. I find it more likely that a ban or moratorium would make sense for specific uses of a technology than for the technology per se, because for facial recognition, there might be useful public purposes, including in the law enforcement domain, where despite the privacy restrictions of facial recognition, that overall the public good is in favor of using the technology. So I would look at it in terms, again, of specific uses for technology. And in that regard, yes, it would make sense to prohibit certain uses.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Last up, Mr. Collins. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Alan Weintraub, given what we've talked about this afternoon about dark money in politics, how difficult it is to properly have any kind of proper oversight of what happens on platforms like Facebook, are you frightened by the news that Facebook is, well, it's reported that Facebook is going to launch its own cryptocurrency?
Yes.
You are. You're frightened by the prospect. Yeah. I think you're right to be frightened by the prospect. I mean, this thing, given all the other problems we've talked about, this seems like a sort of, a political money launderer's charter. I mean, do you not think people will look back on this period of time and say we had, sophisticated democracies and societies that have developed decades of rules and regulations on campaign finance, electoral law, personal rights over data and privacy, oversight of broadcast media news and other forms of news as well, and that we were prepared to see all of those decades of experience bypassed by a company like Facebook simply because that's the way their business model works, and that it's unsustainable, the position that we're in at the moment.
Whether it's unsustainable, whether it requires further regulation, I think is exactly why all of you are sitting around this table today.
But in some ways, I mean, listening to the discussion in this last session, we're tying ourselves in knots, trying to solve a problem that's been caused by a company, and actually, it may well be the solution is rather than having to abandon lots of things that we value because they've been put there to protect citizens and citizens' rights. We actually should say to these companies, this is what we expect of you, and we will enforce this upon you if we can't be convinced there's any other way of doing it, and we're not prepared to tolerate people being exposed to dark ads, elections being interfered with by bad actors, disinformation, hate speech spreading uncontrolled, and that actually these are not the standards we expect in a decent society. And we say that recognising that platforms like Facebook have become the main media channel in terms of how people get news and information for anywhere between a third and a half of Europeans and Americans.
I think there is a real risk trying to take a set of rules that evolved in the 20th century and assuming that they're going to be equally appropriate for the technologies of the 21st century.
I think that's right. I think that's right. The final comment for me is I think that's right that those rules have been demonstrated to be out of date because of new technology and the way people engage with content in the world. But surely what should remain is the values that brought those rules in the first place. And in saying that those rules need to change because technology's changed is one thing. But what we shouldn't say is we should abandon those values simply because they've become harder to enforce.
Absolutely agree with that.
I agree. Totally.
Yeah. I just would like to finish up with just one thing. We've been talking about the subpoena to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg for some time, and just as chair of this committee, we're doing our very best to make sure that they attended today. And we're limited by what's in this book and what are the laws of our country. And yet the platforms seem to operate in their own bubbles without any restriction within our jurisdictions. And that's the frustration for us as legislators in this place. So again, thank you for appearing today, and thank you for assisting us, especially Mr. Tarian, Commissioner Tarian, on your work in assisting this committee. And we look forward to keep those conversations going in the future. I'll just say some housekeeping aspects of what's going to happen tonight. Dinner's going to happen at 7, so that's downstairs. It's 035, so this is 225, so 2 floors down. That will be where dinner is. It's at 7. Just so to be clear, each delegation is to give a brief presentation on what your country has done and is looking at doing to fix this problem. I'll be talking with my vice chairs just to talk about how we're going to deliver what we are doing in Canada, but challenge you to have that ready. Again, it's just going to be brief. It can be informal. It doesn't need to be a big written presentation. I see some very serious looks on faces like, oh, what did we just get ourselves into? More importantly, I see a lot of tired faces. I think we're all ready just to go back to our hotel for about an hour's rest, and then we'll reconvene at 7. I think that's all I have to say for now, but again, we'll see you back at 7. Thank you.
Just
Mr.
a
Angus?
point of order, Chair, before you try and shut us all down. I do want to commend your excellent work, the excellent work of the staff, our analysts who put this together. And Mr. Collins, which was done in England. This is above and beyond. I think we have really set a standard that I'm hoping in the next Parliament and maybe in other jurisdictions we can maintain this conversation. So you've done incredible work on this, and we really commend you for it.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Thank you. And thank you for that. And for the record, we will be holding the other platforms to account tomorrow morning at 8:30. So anyway, we'll see you tonight at 7.
Thank you.